Oh, do come in. It seems we have another little puzzle on our hands, don't we?
Death at the Classic Car Show, narrated by Connor from Velvet Clues. Welcome to Velvet Clues, where mysteries unravel in the most unexpected places. I'm Connor, and tonight I'm taking you on a journey with one of literature's finest detectives, Miss Jane Marple, as she finds herself entangled in a curious case of deception and murder. Before we begin, I'd like to ask you something. Have you ever wondered how well you truly know the people around you? How easily trust can be exploited, or how desperation can drive someone to commit the unthinkable? Share your thoughts in the comments below. For now, settle in with your favourite beverage, dim the lights, and join us as Miss Marple navigates a world of vintage automobiles, forged histories, and carefully hidden secrets. This is the story of death at the Classic Car Show. Chapter 1. The exhibition opens with a hidden agenda. The morning sun cast long shadows across the grounds of Ashworth Manor, where the annual Classic Car exhibition had commenced with all the pomp and ceremony that such an event demanded. Miss Jane Marple, who had been persuaded by her old friend Eleanor Whitmore to attend what Eleanor described as a most civilized gathering of automotive enthusiasts, observed the assembled crowd with her characteristic mild interest. The vehicles themselves were undeniably impressive, gleaming examples of mechanical engineering from an era when automobiles were considered works of art rather than mere transportation. Miss Marple, however, found herself more intrigued by the people surrounding the vehicles than by the motor cars themselves. Eleanor had greeted her with genuine warmth, her usually animated features brightened by genuine pleasure at Miss Marple's acceptance of her invitation. They had known each other for some 30 years, and Eleanor's late husband had been a passionate collector of vintage automobiles, a hobby she had maintained with considerable enthusiasm, despite his passing nearly a decade previous. Eleanor was dressed, as always, with impeccable taste, her pale blue dress complementing the silver of her carefully coiffed hair. She guided Miss Marple through the exhibition with the comfortable knowledge of someone who had attended every classic car exhibition for the past 2 decades. The exhibition itself occupied several acres of manicured grounds, with the rarest and most valuable vehicles displayed in positions of honour beneath white canvas tents that provided protection from the English weather. Lesser treasures were arranged in carefully organised rows, each accompanied by detailed information cards describing the vehicle's provenance, previous owners, and historical significance. It was one of these information cards that first caught Miss Marple's attention, though she could not have articulated precisely why at the moment she observed it. The card accompanied a 1924 Rolls Royce Phantom, an extraordinarily beautiful automobile with curves that seemed to flow like water in steel and glass. According to the accompanying documentation, the vehicle had once belonged to a minor member of the royal family, had been used by a famous film director during the golden age of Hollywood, and had subsequently been owned by a celebrated jazz musician before being restored to its current condition by its present owner, Mr. Bernard Hastings. Eleanor noticed her companion's lingering attention to this particular vehicle. "That's Bernard's pride and joy," she remarked with evident affection. "Absolutely gorgeous, isn't it? Bernard has spent a small fortune having it fully restored. He's quite the collector, you know. Absolutely devoted to acquiring the finest examples of automotive history." Miss Marple nodded politely, though something in her mind had registered a small discord, a note that seemed ever so slightly out of place in the symphony of the exhibition. They were interrupted by the approach of a tall, distinguished gentleman whose bearing suggested considerable confidence in his own importance. "Bernard Hastings himself," Eleanor whispered, and Miss Marple's keen eyes took in the details of his appearance. He was a man of perhaps 60 years, with the sort of weathered face that suggested outdoor pursuits and a certain ruggedness, despite his evidently expensive tailoring. His hands were large and capable, bearing the calluses of someone who had worked extensively with machinery, though his present circumstances suggested he no longer engaged in such physical labour. "Eleanor, darling," Hastings greeted her warmly, pressing her hand with obvious affection before turning his attention to Miss Marple, with the automatic courtesy of a man accustomed to charming everyone he encountered. "And you must be the legendary Miss Marple that Eleanor has mentioned so often. I cannot tell you what a pleasure it is to meet you. The exhibition is particularly fortunate to have such distinguished company in attendance." Miss Marple accepted, his greeting with her characteristic grace, though she noted the way his smile seemed to fade ever so slightly when Eleanor introduced her simply as a friend from the village. They were discussing the merits of the Phantom when a commotion nearby drew their attention. A younger man, perhaps in his early 40s, with the distinctly aggressive bearing of someone accustomed to getting his own way, was engaged in what appeared to be a heated conversation with one of the exhibition officials. His expensive clothing and the authoritative manner in which he addressed those around him suggested considerable wealth and a well-developed sense of his own importance. "That's Victor Caldwell," Eleanor explained quietly. "He's another collector, though of a very different temperament than Bernard. Victor made his fortune in property development, and he's been acquiring classic automobiles at an almost obsessive rate over the past few years. The two of them have been bidding against each other, regularly at auctions, and I'm afraid the rivalry has become somewhat bitter." Miss Marple observed the exchange with growing interest, noting how Bernard Hastings carefully positioned himself away from Victor Caldwell, and how his expression became noticeably cool whenever their eyes accidentally met. Such antagonism suggested a history considerably more complex than simple competitive bidding, though the exact nature of their dispute remained obscure to her at this point. As they continued their perambulation through the exhibition, Miss Marple noted various other individuals who seemed to hover around the vehicles with more than casual interest. There was a woman of perhaps 50 years, with the distinctive bearing and careful grooming of someone who had once been considerably more physically striking than time now permitted. She introduced herself as Dr. Margaret Stanford, and her conversation was punctuated by references to her extensive expertise in automotive authentication and historical documentation. Her credentials, as she presented them, were formidable, though Miss Marple detected a certain brittleness in her manner, as though some internal tension required constant management. There was also a younger man who appeared to be serving as an assistant to one of the exhibition officials, though his manner suggested he possessed considerably more knowledge than his title indicated. He moved through the gathered vehicles with the careful attention of someone engaged in detailed study, examining each vehicle with what appeared to be professional scrutiny rather than casual admiration. The exhibition's official opening ceremony was scheduled for late afternoon, with a champagne reception and formal dinner to follow. Eleanor had secured tickets for both herself and Miss Marple, which would allow them to observe the full pageantry of the event. As the afternoon progressed, Miss Marple found herself reviewing the various details she had observed, searching for some coherent pattern that might illuminate the strange discord she had sensed upon arrival. It was Eleanor who first mentioned the reason for Miss Marple's particular invitation to the exhibition beyond her own companionship. "There's been some concern," Eleanor began hesitantly, as they settled into chairs in Eleanor's private viewing tent, about the authenticity of some of the vehicles on display. Certain collectors have been expressing doubts about the provenance documentation for several automobiles, particularly some of those recently acquired by Bernard. The exhibition committee felt that having someone of your particular talents in attendance might prove helpful if any irregularities were discovered. Miss Marple raised her eyebrows slightly, though she was not entirely surprised by this revelation. She had long recognized that Eleanor would not have extended such an invitation purely on the basis of their friendship, however genuine that affection might be. "So, you suspect some fraud may be involved in this exhibition," she observed gently. Eleanor hesitated, then nodded slowly. "It's all rather vague and unsubstantiated at present, but there have been whispers that some of the documentation surrounding certain sales may not be entirely accurate. I thought your observation and discretion might prove invaluable should any genuine problems arise." As the afternoon light began to soften into evening, and the crowds assembled for the official opening ceremony, Miss Marple reflected on the curious undercurrents of tension that seemed to animate the gathering. A missing daughter, fabricated histories and rivalries, born of something considerably more significant than mere competitive spirit, seemed to lie beneath the polished surface of the exhibition. The vintage automobiles themselves, gleaming reminders of a more elegant past, seemed almost to mock the very human frailties that surrounded them. Chapter 2, The Opening Night, holds hidden tensions. The Champagne reception had drawn a considerable crowd to the main pavilion, where the exhibition's most prestigious vehicles were displayed beneath elaborate lighting that cast the polished metalwork in golden hues. Miss Marple, dressed in an elegant grey silk dress that Eleanor had assured her was perfectly appropriate for such an occasion, positioned herself where she could observe the assembled guests with the unobtrusive attention that had served her so well throughout her life. The conversations flowing around her provided an unexpectedly rich source of information regarding the tensions and anxieties that animated this particular gathering. She had been standing near the refreshment table, ostensibly examining the various offerings with mild interest, when she overheard a conversation between Victor Caldwell and a gentleman whom she correctly identified as Marcus Ashford, the exhibition's chief curator and official arbiter of authenticity. Victor was expressing his concerns in tones that barely concealed considerable frustration and anger. "I'm telling you, Ashford, something isn't right about Hastings' acquisition record," he was saying, his voice pitched low but carrying sufficient intensity to carry clearly to Miss Marple's attentive ears. 3 vehicles in the past 18 months, all allegedly with impeccable provenance, all acquired at prices considerably below their documented value. Either Bernard has discovered some miracle source for bargain automobiles, or someone is engaged in systematic fraud. Marcus Ashford, a thin and nervous gentleman of approximately 60 years, with the scholarly bearing of an academic, despite his professional duties in the automotive world, appeared distinctly uncomfortable with this conversation. "Victor, I really cannot discuss such matters outside of proper channels. If you have documented concerns regarding any vehicle's authentication, I urge you to present them formally to the exhibition committee. Our authentication procedures are rigorous, and I have personally verified the documentation for the vehicles in question." Yet Victor appeared unconvinced. "Verified documentation," he scoffed, "when that documentation might itself be fraudulent. I've been in this business long enough to recognize the subtle signs of falsification. Altered provenance details, doctored photographs showing vehicles in historical contexts, forged bills of sale. It's becoming increasingly sophisticated, and I suspect someone at this exhibition is at the very center of it." Miss Marple found this conversation most illuminating, and she filed away the information with the careful attention she applied to such matters. She was beginning to perceive the outlines of a considerably more complex situation than Eleanor's initial vague suggestion of potential irregularities had indicated. This was not merely a matter of authentication disputes, she suspected, but rather evidence of systematic fraud involving the deliberate falsification of automotive provenance documents. As the evening progressed, she observed Bernard Hastings accepting congratulations on the magnificence of his Phantom, the centerpiece of the exhibition, which was attracting considerable admiration from the assembled guests. His manner was urbane and gracious, yet Miss Marple detected the underlying tension in the set of his shoulders whenever Victor Caldwell was mentioned or came into view. Whatever history lay between these two men, it was clearly a matter of considerable significance to Bernard. It was during this period of observation that Miss Marple encountered Dr. Margaret Stanford more formally. The woman approached her with the evident intention of engaging in conversation, her movements betraying a certain desperation, as though she had been gathering courage for this interaction. "Miss Marple, I believe we may have been introduced earlier this afternoon," she began, somewhat awkwardly. "I wonder if I might have a few moments of your time. There's something of considerable importance that I should like to discuss, though I confess I'm uncertain how to approach the matter." Miss Marple gestured toward a quieter corner of the pavilion, away from the main flow of conversation. "Dr. Stanford, I would be delighted to hear whatever concerns you. Please, speak freely." Margaret Stanford lowered herself into the chair beside Miss Marple with visible relief, as though the simple act of sitting required considerable effort. "I don't know if Eleanor has mentioned it," she began carefully, "but my professional reputation has been quite thoroughly destroyed by the proliferation of fraudulent provenance documents within the automotive collecting community. For many years, I maintained a business providing authentication services for serious collectors. My expertise was quite extensively recognized, and my certifications carried significant weight in the marketplace. However, approximately 2 years ago, I became aware that several of my Previous authentications were being called into question. Initially, I thought there had been some genuine errors in my evaluation process, but further investigation revealed something far more disturbing. The documentation accompanying the vehicles I had authenticated was being systematically altered after the fact, with my legitimate certifications being incorporated into fabricated historical narratives designed to support deliberately falsified provenance. Miss Marple listened with careful attention, noting the genuine anguish in Margaret's voice and the way her hands trembled as she spoke. Someone had deliberately used her legitimate expertise as a foundation for elaborate fraud, systematically damaging her reputation in the process. The cruelty of such an action was not lost on her, nor was the intelligence required to execute such a scheme. My business collapsed within months, Margaret continued, her voice barely above a whisper. No serious collector would engage my services, after word spread that my authentications were apparently unreliable. I attempted to pursue legal remedies, but without definitive proof of the fraud, my attorneys advised me that any lawsuit would be both expensive and likely unsuccessful. I have spent the past 2 years attempting to rebuild my reputation, but the damage has been essentially irreversible. My name has become synonymous with fraudulent authentication in the automotive collecting world. Do you have any idea who might be responsible for this systematic campaign against your professional reputation? Miss Marple inquired gently. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, her eyes distant and troubled. I have my suspicions, she finally replied. Suspicions that I lack the courage to articulate publicly, given the legal liability such accusations would entail. However, I would point you toward examining the provenance documentation for the vehicles acquired by Bernard Hastings over the past 2 years. I believe you may find a pattern that is most illuminating. Before Miss Marple could respond with further questions, Eleanor appeared, expressing concern about her companion's welfare and inviting her to view the formal dinner arrangements that were being prepared in the adjacent pavilion. The evening was progressing according to the exhibition's schedule, with various ceremonies and presentations planned to occur before the guests were dismissed for the night. Yet, as Miss Marple made her way toward the dining pavilion, she found herself profoundly troubled by the implications of Margaret Stanford's revelations. What had begun to emerge was a picture of systematic fraud, deliberate reputation destruction, and rivalries born of something considerably more significant than competitive bidding at auctions. The beautiful vintage automobiles, monuments to an earlier era of mechanical elegance, seemed to have become instruments of deception and corruption in the hands of those who valued profit above integrity. Chapter 3. A Body in the Phantom Rolls Royce. The morning following the exhibition's opening ceremony dawned grey and drizzly, typical English weather that seemed to mock the elegance of the previous evening's celebration. Miss Marple had risen early, as was her custom, and was contemplating the various revelations of the previous day while seated in the breakfast room of the modest hotel in which she had taken accommodation. Eleanor had invited her to stay at her own house, but Miss Marple had politely declined, preferring the independence and discretion that a hotel provided when she was engaged in matters that required careful observation and analysis. She was reviewing her notes regarding the previous evening's conversations when a commotion could be heard from the direction of the exhibition grounds. The sound of raised voices, the blast of what appeared to be an official whistle, and the distinctive timbre of someone in considerable distress reached her even at her distance from the exhibition's main pavilion. Miss Marple recognized these sounds as the preliminary indicators of something significantly more serious than a minor incident or dispute among the gathered enthusiasts. She prepared herself with her characteristic unhurried efficiency and made her way toward the exhibition grounds, her mind already turning over the possibilities that might account for such obvious alarm. Upon arriving at the main pavilion, she found the gathered crowd in a state of considerable agitation, with several individuals standing apart from the general assembly, with the distinctive bearing of those possessed of unwelcome knowledge. It was Eleanor who spotted her approaching and made her way through the crowd to intercept her companion. "Jane!" Eleanor exclaimed, clearly distressed. "Something absolutely dreadful has occurred. Bernard Hastings has been found dead, apparently in his phantom. They believe it may be some sort of accident, but the circumstances are most peculiar. Miss Marple felt the familiar chill that always accompanied the prospect of serious harm, though her expression remained composed and her manner calm. "Where exactly is Mr. Hastings at present, Eleanor? And has anyone summoned the proper authorities?" Eleanor gestured toward the tent housing the phantom Rolls Royce, where several official-looking individuals could be seen engaged in what appeared to be preliminary investigation of the vehicle. "The police have been telephoned," Eleanor confirmed. "They should arrive within the hour." Some of the exhibition staff discovered Bernard this morning when they arrived to prepare the vehicles for the day's activities. He was seated in the driver's position, apparently asleep, but when they attempted to wake him, they discovered he was quite deceased. Miss Marple made her way toward the tent containing the phantom, her keen eyes taking in the details of the scene with meticulous attention. The vehicle itself was magnificent, a masterpiece of automotive engineering, with an interior upholstered in the finest leather and accented with polished mahogany. Bernard Hastings remained seated behind the steering mechanism, his head tilted back against the leather upholstery, in a position that might have suggested peaceful slumber had his complete pallor and the evident cessation of respiration not indicated a considerably more final condition. Standing near the vehicle was a young man whom Miss Marple recognized as the assistant she had observed moving through the exhibition with professional scrutiny the previous day. His name, she recalled from Eleanor's introduction, was James Whitfield, and he appeared to be in a state of considerable distress, having been the individual who first discovered Bernard's lifeless form. Beside him stood Marcus Ashford, the exhibition's chief curator, who appeared to be engaged in anxious conversation with a distinguished gentleman, whom Miss Marple correctly identified as Dr. Edmund Wallace, the local physician who served the area surrounding Ashworth Manor. It was Dr. Wallace who first acknowledged Miss Marple's arrival, recognizing her from previous encounters in their respective communities. "Miss Marple," he greeted her with evident relief, "I am most pleased to see you. Your perspective in such matters has proven valuable in the past. I have only recently examined the deceased, and I confess myself puzzled by certain aspects of his condition." "What aspects in particular cause you concern, Dr. Wallace?" Miss Marple inquired, positioning herself where she could examine the deceased without disturbing any potential evidence. "The colour of his face, primarily. There is a distinctly rosy hue to his complexion that suggests carbon monoxide poisoning, yet I can perceive no obvious source for such a gas within the vehicle. The windows are closed, as is the door, but there is no exhaust pipe or heating system that might account for the introduction of such a toxic substance." This observation proved most illuminating to Miss Marple, and her mind immediately began constructing potential explanations for such an apparently inexplicable situation. Carbon monoxide poisoning was typically associated with exposure to vehicle exhausts or faulty heating systems, yet the apparent intactness of the Phantom's cabin suggested such conventional sources were unlikely. She was contemplating the peculiar circumstances when a motor vehicle was heard approaching the exhibition grounds, followed shortly by the arrival of Inspector Robert Hartley, a gentleman of perhaps 55 years whom Miss Marple had encountered several times in her long experience with criminal investigation. The inspector was accompanied by a sergeant and several constables, all of whom immediately set about establishing the protocols that such circumstances demanded. Inspector Hartley surveyed the assembled gathering with the characteristic expression of professional scepticism that Miss Marple had come to know so well. "I understand we have a death of suspicious circumstances," he announced, his voice carrying the authority of official duty. "I shall require the scene to be cordoned off, and I need statements from anyone who had contact with the deceased in the past 24 hours. Additionally, no one is to leave the exhibition grounds without my express permission." As the inspector set about organising his investigation, Miss Marple found herself studying the Phantom's interior with the meticulous attention that such circumstances demanded. The vehicle's windows were indeed closed, and the door was securely shut. The steering wheel, the dashboard, and the general interior appointments all appeared entirely normal, bearing no obvious indication of what might have caused Bernard Hastings' death. Yet it was a small detail that caught her attention, a detail so subtle that she was certain others had overlooked it. The interior of the vehicle bore a faint odour, something acrid and chemical that seemed somehow inconsistent with the leather and automobile polish that would typically characterize the interior of such a vehicle. She leaned slightly closer, careful not to touch anything, and detected the unmistakable scent of automotive exhaust, the distinctive smell of burning gasoline and incomplete combustion that was the characteristic signature of carbon monoxide poisoning. But how such an odour could have entered the sealed cabin remained entirely unexplained, and Miss Marple sensed that the true mystery of Bernard Hastings' death lay in answering that singular question. Chapter 4. The Curator's Confession Holds Unexpected Truths. The police investigation of the phantom Rolls Royce occupied the entire day, and well into the evening, with Inspector Hartley systematically examining every conceivable detail of the vehicle and the circumstances surrounding Bernard Hastings' death. The exhibition itself had been temporarily suspended, with the gathered vehicles secured and the assembled enthusiasts relegated to various locations about the exhibition grounds, all under police supervision. It was during the late afternoon, as the initial forensic examination of the vehicle was being concluded, that Dr. Wallace approached Miss Marple with news of his preliminary findings. The carbon monoxide levels in the deceased's bloodstream are extraordinarily elevated, he informed her quietly, out of the hearing of the General Assembly, far higher than would be consistent with exposure to typical automotive exhaust. Someone has deliberately introduced a concentrated source of carbon monoxide gas into that sealed vehicle. This confirmation of Miss Marple's suspicions regarding the deliberate nature of Bernard Hastings' death cast the entire situation in a considerably more sinister light. This was not a tragic accident resulting from mechanical failure or unfortunate circumstance, but rather a carefully planned and executed act of murder. It was Inspector Hartley who made the next significant discovery, calling Miss Marple and Eleanor to examine something that he had found within the vehicle's interior. Beneath the driver's seat, carefully concealed in what appeared to be a custom-designed compartment, were several documents of considerable significance. Hastings appeared to have been attempting to conceal these items in a location where they would not readily be discovered by casual inspection. The documents proved to be a fascinating collection of correspondence, photographic evidence, and what appeared to be draft documentation relating to the provenance history of several automobiles. Marcus Ashford's face went notably pale as he examined the materials, his hands visibly trembling as he studied the photographic evidence that appeared to conclusively demonstrate the fraudulent nature of several vehicle authentications. Inspector Hartley's expression grew increasingly grim as he reviewed the documentation. These appear to be records relating to systematic provenance fraud, he observed, his tone carrying the particular anger that law enforcement officials typically exhibit when confronted with evidence of deliberate deception. Can anyone explain what these documents represent? The silence that greeted his question was profound and eloquent in its implications. It was Eleanor who finally spoke, her voice barely audible above the gentle evening sounds surrounding the exhibition grounds. "These must be Bernard's records of the fraud he was perpetrating," she whispered. "The forged documentation, the falsified provenance histories, all of it documented in his own hand." But this revelation was interrupted by the sudden appearance of Marcus Ashford, the exhibition's chief curator, who stepped forward with the bearing of a man who had finally reached the limits of his endurance. "I can explain everything," he announced, his voice trembling with the intensity of suppressed emotion. "Bernard Hastings was not the perpetrator of the fraud. I was. I created the forged documents. I falsified the provenance histories. I orchestrated the entire systematic deception." The assembled gathering fell into stunned silence as Ashford continued his confession. "I have spent my entire life studying automotive history and authentication," he explained, his hands gesturing with barely controlled emotion. "My expertise was recognized and respected throughout the collecting community. Yet my career offered only modest financial rewards, while I observed individuals with far inferior knowledge accumulating considerable wealth through the acquisition and resale of classic automobiles." Ashford's voice grew steadier as he continued his confession. "Bernard Hastings approached me approximately 3 years ago with a proposition. He had limited knowledge of automotive history, but he possessed considerable wealth and the desire to assemble an impressive collection. He proposed that I create falsified documentation for various ordinary automobiles, transforming them through elaborate historical narratives into vehicles with celebrity ownership or other distinguished histories. He would then sell these fraudulently documented vehicles at enormous prices, and I would receive a substantial percentage of the profits. The scheme proved remarkably effective, Ashford continued, his expression reflecting both pride in the sophistication of his deception and profound regret for the consequences it had engendered. I created entire historical narratives, complete with forged bills of sale, fabricated photographs showing the vehicles in historical contexts, and elaborate biographical documentation connecting each automobile to celebrated individuals. The fraud would have continued indefinitely, generating millions in illegal profit, had I not made a critical error in judgment approximately 1 year ago. And what error might that have been? Inspector Hartley inquired, his professional interest clearly engaged by this unexpected turn of events. I utilised the legitimate authentication credentials of Dr. Margaret Stanford, Ashford admitted reluctantly. I forged her signatures and incorporated her actual authentication methodology into my fraudulent provenance documentation. This lent the forged materials an almost impeccable appearance of legitimacy, as they bore the apparent endorsement of one of the most respected authenticators in the collecting community. However, Ashford continued, Margaret eventually discovered that her professional credentials and methodology were being misused to validate fraudulent provenance. She began investigating the matter systematically, which ultimately led to the revelation that her authentication services were being fraudulently utilized. Her professional reputation was essentially destroyed in the process, as collectors began questioning the reliability of all her previous authentications, regardless of whether they had actually been subject to fraudulent manipulation. This revelation provoked audible gasps from the assembled gathering, and Miss Marple found herself regarding Ashford with a complex mixture of sympathies. Here was a man of considerable intellectual capability and technical expertise who had allowed greed and resentment to corrupt his professional integrity, resulting in the systematic destruction of an innocent woman's career. Inspector Hartley appeared less sympathetic. Mr. Ashford, your confession regarding the systematic fraud is noted, he stated formally. However, this does not explain the presence of these documents in Bernard Hastings' possession, nor does it account for his death. Did Bernard Hastings attempt to implicate you in the fraud scheme by documenting your involvement? Ashford's expression grew noticeably more troubled. Bernard was attempting to distance himself from the fraud, he admitted reluctantly. He claimed that he had been manipulated and deceived, that he believed. The provenance documentation I provided was legitimate. He was gathering evidence to prove his own innocence and to demonstrate that I had acted independently in creating the forged materials. Bernard intended to provide these documents to the police, effectively betraying me in an attempt to minimize his own legal liability. And this angered you sufficiently to murder him? Inspector Hartley pressed. Ashford hesitated, then shook his head slowly. No, Inspector, I did not murder Bernard Hastings. Despite my anger at his intended betrayal, I did not kill him. However, I suspect I may know who did. Chapter 5. The Mechanic's Secret and the Historian's Revenge. The revelation that someone beyond Bernard Hastings and Marcus Ashford was implicated in the case proved singularly significant, and Inspector Hartley's questions regarding Ashford's suspected identity of the murderer became increasingly pointed and urgent. Yet Ashford proved frustratingly reluctant to articulate his suspicions without the protection of legal counsel, insisting that he required his solicitor's presence before providing further information. It was during this period of investigative standoff that Miss Marple requested a private conversation with Inspector Hartley away from the General Assembly. The inspector, who had learned through previous encounters to respect her analytical capabilities, granted this request with evident willingness. They withdrew to one of the private pavilions, where Eleanor had thoughtfully arranged for refreshment to be provided to the officials engaged in the investigation. "Inspector," Miss Marple began, once they were securely away from the ears of the general gathering, "I believe I may be able to suggest a line of investigation that might prove productive. You have Marcus Ashford's confession regarding the systematic provenance fraud. You have clear evidence that Bernard Hastings possessed documentation of Ashford's criminal activities. What remains? Unclear is the mechanism by which carbon monoxide gas was introduced into the sealed Phantom Rolls Royce. Indeed, Inspector Hartley agreed, consulting his notes with evident frustration. Our mechanical examination of the vehicle reveals no evidence of tampering with the exhaust system or any other obvious mechanism for introducing carbon monoxide. Yet the deceased's condition clearly indicates exposure to a concentrated source of that particular gas. Miss Marple settled herself more comfortably in her chair, her expression reflecting the intense concentration she applied to the most difficult aspects of her investigative work. The vehicle is a 1924 Phantom, she mused, manufactured during an era when automotive technology was considerably less sophisticated than modern standards. The exhaust system would be relatively basic compared to contemporary vehicles, with metal piping and minimal emission controls. What I would propose, she continued, is that someone with considerable mechanical knowledge might have modified the exhaust system to direct the carbon monoxide gas into the vehicle's sealed cabin through a concealed pipe or hose connected to the interior. If such a modification were accomplished with sufficient skill and care, the evidence of tampering might prove difficult to detect without extremely detailed examination of the vehicle's undercarriage. Inspector Hartley rose from his chair with evident interest. An excellent suggestion, Miss Marple. I shall have our mechanical specialist conduct a more exhaustive examination of the Phantom's exhaust system. However, this still leaves us with the question of who possessed both the mechanical knowledge to accomplish such a modification and the motivation to murder Bernard Hastings. Miss Marple allowed herself a slight smile. I wonder, Inspector, whether you might conduct some investigation into the background of individuals who have sustained damage through Bernard Hastings' fraudulent activities. I found myself particularly intrigued by Dr. Margaret Stanford, whose professional reputation has been essentially destroyed through the systematic misuse of her credentials and authentication methodology. Inspector Hartley's expression grew thoughtful. You suspect Dr. Stanford of murdering Bernard Hastings, despite her apparent lack of direct involvement with the vehicle's mechanical systems? Miss Marple shook her head gently. No, Inspector, I do not suspect Dr. Stanford of perpetrating the murder directly. However, I would suggest that you investigate her professional associations and personal relationships with individuals who might possess the requisite mechanical knowledge to modify the Phantom's exhaust system. The investigation that followed Inspector Hartley's more exhaustive examination of the Phantom's undercarriage proved most illuminating. The mechanical specialist discovered, precisely as Miss Marple had suggested, a carefully concealed modification to the vehicle's exhaust piping. A flexible rubber hose had been connected to the main exhaust manifold, with the opposite end routed through the vehicle's floorboard and into the sealed cabin itself. The hose had been painted to match the undercarriage colour, rendering it nearly invisible to casual inspection. Furthermore, examination of the vehicle's exterior revealed evidence of recent mechanical work, with several of the undercarriage fasteners bearing fresh tool marks, indicating they had been removed and replaced within the past 48 hours. Inspector Hartley immediately expanded his investigation to determine who among the exhibition staff or the gathered collectors possessed the mechanical expertise necessary to accomplish such a modification. It was Eleanor who, upon reflection and further conversation with various members of the exhibition community, provided the critical information that directed the investigation toward its ultimate resolution. She approached Miss Marple in the late afternoon, her expression troubled and her voice carefully lowered to avoid being overheard by the General Assembly. Jane, Eleanor began hesitantly, I've been thinking about something that may be of significance. Do you recall the young man who discovered Bernard's body this morning? James Whitfield, the assistant who appeared to be examining the vehicles with such professional scrutiny. It appears that his father was an accomplished mechanic with extensive experience in automotive restoration work. James himself has inherited his father's considerable mechanical capabilities and has worked on various restoration projects throughout his career. Additionally, Eleanor continued, James has a personal connection to Dr. Margaret Stanford. They are, in fact, distantly related through marriage, though I understand their family connection is somewhat strained. More significantly, James' father suffered considerable financial hardship approximately 2 years ago, when the value of several classic automobiles in his personal collection declined dramatically. This decline in value followed the discovery that the provenance documentation for those vehicles was fraudulent, having been altered after his original authentication. This revelation provided the missing link in the investigative chain, and Inspector Hartley immediately directed his constables to conduct a more thorough background investigation into James Whitfield's history and connections to the fraudulent provenance scheme. The investigation revealed that James's father had indeed suffered severe financial losses as a result of the fraudulent documentation scheme, with several vehicles in his collection becoming essentially worthless once the fraud was exposed. Moreover, James himself had expressed considerable anger and resentment regarding the destruction of his father's reputation and financial stability, particularly as the fraud had been perpetrated in part through the misuse of Dr. Stanford's credentials. The destruction of his relative's professional reputation had combined with the financial losses to his father's estate, creating a powerful motivation for revenge against those responsible for the fraudulent scheme. Inspector Hartley's interrogation of James Whitfield, conducted with Miss Marple's quiet observation, ultimately produced a confession. James had deliberately modified the Phantom's exhaust system during the early morning hours when the exhibition grounds were largely unguarded. He had acted with the specific intention of murdering Bernard Hastings, whom he blamed for initiating the fraudulent provenance scheme that had destroyed both his father's financial stability and Dr. Stanford's professional reputation. Chapter 6. The Will Reveals Hidden Connections. The formal arrest of James Whitfield on suspicion of murder appeared to bring closure to the case, with the confession and mechanical evidence providing seemingly conclusive proof of his guilt. Yet, Miss Marple found herself troubled by certain aspects of the situation that seemed to remain unexplained, despite the apparent finality of Whitfield's arrest and the subsequent closure of the active police investigation. It was Eleanor who, upon Miss Marple's discreet inquiry, provided access to information regarding Bernard Hastings' will and the distribution of his considerable estate. The details of Bernard's will proved most illuminating, containing provisions that cast considerable light on his motivations and intentions during his final days. Bernard had, in fact, prepared a new will only 3 days prior to his death, radically altering the distribution of his extensive collection of vintage automobiles and his considerable financial assets. The previous will had designated his assets to various distant relatives and charitable institutions. The new will, however, directed that the majority of his estate be distributed to institutions dedicated to the exposure and prosecution of fraud within the automotive collecting community. Most significantly, Bernard had designated a substantial bequest to Dr. Margaret Stanford, described in the document as compensation for damages incurred through the fraudulent misuse of her professional credentials and authentication methodology. This revelation proved most significant to Miss Marple's understanding of the case, as it suggested that Bernard Hastings had been engaged in a process of moral reckoning regarding his involvement in the fraudulent provenance scheme. The decision to prepare a new will, combined with his possession of documentation regarding Marcus Ashford's role in the fraud, indicated that Bernard had been moving toward confession and restitution during his final days. Inspector Hartley, upon reviewing the will and its implications, found himself reconsidering certain aspects of his investigation. While James Whitfield's confession regarding the mechanical modification of the Phantom remained valid, the question of whether Whitfield had acted alone or whether others had been involved in the murder conspiracy became increasingly uncertain. It was Miss Marple who suggested, with her characteristic gentleness, that a more thorough examination of the events immediately preceding Bernard Hastings' discovery in the Phantom might prove instructive. She proposed that the precise timeline of the morning's events, combined with detailed interviews regarding who had access to the vehicle during the critical period, might reveal discrepancies that would illuminate the true sequence of events leading to Bernard's death. Inspector Hartley, respecting Miss Marple's analytical capabilities, authorized a comprehensive re-examination of the initial evidence and conducted additional interviews with all individuals who had been present on the exhibition grounds during the critical time period. The investigation that followed revealed several details that had been overlooked in the initial rush to establish the primary facts of the case. Most significantly, testimony from several exhibition staff members revealed that the Phantom Rolls Royce had been worked on by at least 2 individuals during the early morning hours prior to Bernard's discovery. While James Whitfield had indeed accessed the vehicle and performed mechanical modifications to the exhaust system, another individual had apparently been present at approximately the same time, working on the vehicle's interior. Further investigation revealed that Marcus Ashford, the exhibition curator and confessed architect of the provenance fraud scheme, had been present on the exhibition grounds during the early morning hours. Security personnel recalled seeing him moving through the pavilions with unusual purpose, and his explanation regarding his early arrival proved notably vague and unconvincing when subjected to more detailed questioning. It was ultimately Eleanor who provided the crucial information that clarified Marcus Ashford's involvement in the murder conspiracy. Over tea in one of the private pavilions, she explained that she had recalled a conversation with Bernard dating from approximately 2 weeks prior to his death. Bernard had confided that he was experiencing considerable anxiety regarding his intended confession, as he feared Marcus Ashford's potential reaction to his planned betrayal. Bernard had expressed to Eleanor his belief that Marcus might attempt some form of retaliation if he discovered the plan to provide incriminating documentation to the police. Bernard had been particularly concerned about the possibility of some form of sabotage directed at his person, though he had dismissed such concerns as paranoid speculation at the time. Upon reflection, Eleanor had realized that Bernard's fears were not entirely unfounded, and that Marcus Ashford might indeed have possessed both the motive and the opportunity to eliminate Bernard before the incriminating documentation could be provided to the police. While Marcus did not himself possess the mechanical knowledge to modify the Phantom's exhaust system, he might have conspired with James Whitfield to accomplish the murder, leveraging their mutual interest in preventing Bernard from providing evidence to law enforcement authorities. Chapter 7. The conspiracy unravels in the interrogation room. The re-examination of Marcus Ashford's activities during the critical early morning hours, combined with more intense interrogation, ultimately produced a revelation that transformed the case from a murder of singular motivation into a conspiracy involving multiple perpetrators with somewhat different but ultimately compatible motivations. Marcus Ashford, when confronted with the evidence of his presence on the exhibition grounds during the time period when the Phantom was being prepared, finally abandoned his facade of relative innocence regarding Bernard Hastings' death. In a formal interrogation conducted by Inspector Hartley with Miss Marple observing from the adjacent observation room, Ashford provided a detailed confession regarding his role in the murder conspiracy. Ashford explained that he had learned of Bernard's intention to provide incriminating documentation to the police through a chance overhearing of a telephone conversation between Eleanor and Bernard approximately 1 week prior to the murder. Bernard, speaking to Eleanor, had expressed his decision to cooperate fully with law enforcement and provide evidence regarding Marcus's role in the fraudulent provenance scheme in exchange for a reduced sentence. Facing the prospect of a significant prison sentence and the complete destruction of his professional reputation, Marcus had reached out to James Whitfield, whom he had previously observed demonstrating considerable hostility toward Bernard Hastings. Marcus had approached James with a proposition regarding the elimination of Bernard, suggesting that both of them possessed powerful motivations for removing Bernard from the equation before he could provide evidence to the authorities. James Whitfield had initially been reluctant, expressing concern regarding the moral implications of murdering Bernard, despite his legitimate grievances regarding his father's financial losses and Dr. Stanford's professional destruction. However, Marcus had persistently pressed his case, ultimately offering James a substantial financial sum in exchange for his assistance in accomplishing the murder through mechanical means. The conspiracy that had ultimately resulted in Bernard Hastings' death was thus born of mutual interest and financial inducement, rather than shared moral conviction or unified motivation. James had agreed to provide the mechanical expertise necessary to modify the Phantom's exhaust system, while Marcus had planned to ensure that Bernard's body was discovered in the vehicle and that the surrounding circumstances would suggest either accident or natural causes. However, as both men subsequently acknowledged during their interrogations, the conspiracy had not proceeded entirely according to plan. While James had successfully modified the Phantom's exhaust system to direct carbon monoxide into the sealed cabin, and while Bernard had indeed been enticed into the vehicle under false pretenses, the manner in which the murder was ultimately accomplished differed significantly from what either James or Marcus had originally anticipated. Miss Marple, observing the interrogations with her characteristic attention to detail, noted several aspects of the confessions that appeared to contain discrepancies or incomplete information. When she requested a private conversation with Inspector Hartley regarding these observations, the inspector proved receptive to her concerns, despite the apparent clarity of the confessions provided by both Ashford and Whitfield. "I find myself troubled," Miss Marple explained carefully, "by certain details that neither Mr. Ashford nor Mr. Whitfield has fully addressed. The mechanical modification of the Phantom's exhaust system required considerable time and effort to accomplish successfully. Yet both men claim to have completed this work during the early morning hours, presumably without anyone observing them in the process. However, I have reviewed the accounts provided by the exhibition staff, and several individuals report seeing activity around the Phantom during periods when both Ashford and Whitfield claim to have been elsewhere. Furthermore," she continued, "the amount of time required to entice Bernard into the vehicle and ensure that the carbon monoxide modification would function correctly suggests that someone other than Ashford and Whitfield must have been involved in the actual murder. While Ashford and Whitfield may have collaborated regarding the planning and preparation of the murder mechanism, I suspect a third party may have been responsible for actually luring Bernard into the vehicle and ensuring his exposure to the lethal carbon monoxide concentration." Inspector Hartley's expression reflected both appreciation for Miss Marple's observation and frustration at the complications it introduced. "If your theory is correct, Miss Marple, then we may be dealing with a conspiracy more extensive than both Ashford and Whitfield have acknowledged. Do you have any suggestions regarding the identity of this potential third party?" Miss Marple was quiet for a moment, her keen eyes reflecting the intensity of her concentration. "Inspector, I would suggest that you conduct a detailed examination of the financial transactions involving Bernard Hastings during the months immediately preceding his death. Specifically, I would be interested in identifying any substantial sums of money transferred to or from individuals associated with the exhibition or the automotive collecting community. The motivation for James Whitfield's participation in the murder conspiracy involved both revenge and financial compensation. It is entirely possible that another individual may have been motivated by financial considerations alone. Acting upon this suggestion, Inspector Hartley's investigation revealed a series of substantial financial transfers from Bernard Hastings' accounts to an unexpected recipient. The transfers had been made to Victor Caldwell, the aggressive and ambitious collector who had publicly expressed concerns regarding the authenticity of Bernard's acquisitions, and who had been engaged in what appeared to be a bitter rivalry with Bernard for several years. Chapter 8. The jealous rival reveals his motive. The discovery of the financial transfers between Bernard Hastings and Victor Caldwell introduced a new and unexpected dimension to the murder conspiracy, transforming what had appeared to be a relatively straightforward case of revenge and self-protection into a far more complex web of motivations and mutual interests. Upon interrogation, Victor Caldwell initially denied any involvement in Bernard Hastings' death, insisting that the financial transfers represented payment for various business arrangements and automotive transactions that had nothing to do with the murder conspiracy. However, faced with the detailed documentation of these transfers and their timing in relation to James Whitfield's discussions with Marcus Ashford regarding Bernard's murder, Victor's resistance to interrogation ultimately crumbled. Victor's confession revealed that his public rivalry with Bernard Hastings had been considerably more significant and personal than the mere competitive bidding at auctions that had appeared to animate their relationship. Years previously, Victor had been engaged to marry a woman named Catherine Pembroke, whom he had deeply loved and intended to wed. However, Catherine had terminated their engagement and subsequently married Bernard Hastings, despite Bernard being considerably older and lacking any of the romantic qualities that Victor had possessed. The marriage had been short-lived and notoriously unhappy, with Catherine ultimately abandoning Bernard and departing to continental Europe, where she had subsequently died in circumstances that remained somewhat mysterious. Bernard, however, had never recovered from the dissolution of the marriage, and according to several accounts, had continued to harbour resentment toward Victor, despite the passage of considerable time since the original romantic entanglement. Victor, for his part, had nursed his own grievances regarding the incident, though he had channeled his emotional pain into the pursuit of wealth and the systematic acquisition of rare automobiles. His rivalry with Bernard regarding the collection of vintage automobiles had thus represented not merely competitive spirit, but rather a deep-seated desire to demonstrate his superiority to Bernard across multiple dimensions of existence. The discovery of Bernard's involvement in systematic provenance fraud had provided Victor with an unexpected opportunity for revenge. Victor had learned of the fraud through his own network of contacts within the collecting community, and he had recognized that Bernard's fraudulent activities had created a situation wherein Bernard was vulnerable to blackmail and manipulation. Victor had approached James Whitfield with an offer of substantial financial compensation in exchange for his assistance in eliminating Bernard before the fraud could be exposed through official channels. However, Victor's confession revealed an additional layer of complexity to the conspiracy. While Victor had not personally participated in the mechanical modification of the Phantom or the actual murder itself, he had been the individual responsible for enticing Bernard into the vehicle on the morning of his death. Victor had arranged a private meeting with Bernard, ostensibly to discuss certain business matters and to propose what he described as a potentially lucrative opportunity to develop a new venture together. Bernard, unsuspecting of Victor's involvement in the murder conspiracy and unaware that the electrical modification to the Phantom had been completed, had entered the vehicle in response to Victor's invitation. Once Bernard was securely inside the sealed cabin, Victor had activated the carbon monoxide delivery system by engaging the vehicle's engine, thereby setting in motion the chain of events that would result in Bernard's death. The participation of Victor Caldwell in the murder conspiracy suggested that what had initially appeared to be a case of revenge and self-protection had actually involved multiple layers of motivation, all of which had converged to result in Bernard Hastings' carefully planned and executed death. While James Whitfield had been motivated by his desire to punish Bernard for his role in the destruction of his father's financial stability, Marcus Ashford had been motivated by his desire to prevent Bernard from providing incriminating evidence to law enforcement, and Victor Caldwell had been motivated by his long-standing personal resentment and romantic jealousy. The investigation of Victor Caldwell's background and his relationship to Bernard Hastings revealed the full historical context of his involvement in the murder conspiracy. Victor's life over the preceding decades had been substantially shaped by his emotional loss of Catherine Pembroke and his subsequent resentment toward Bernard. The opportunity to eliminate Bernard, while simultaneously preventing the exposure of fraud that would have destroyed Bernard's reputation and financial stability, represented, in Victor's mind, a form of justice that transcended conventional morality. Chapter 9. Documentation of deception across years. The complete resolution of the murder conspiracy involving Bernard Hastings required the examination of extensive documentation spanning several years, during which the various threads of motivation and opportunity had gradually woven together to create the circumstances that ultimately resulted in his death. Miss Marple, with her characteristic patience and attention to detail, devoted considerable effort to reviewing this documentation and identifying the precise sequence of events that had led inexorably toward the tragic conclusion. The investigation revealed that the systematic provenance fraud orchestrated by Marcus Ashford and Bernard Hastings had operated continuously for approximately 3 years, during which more than 40 vehicles had been deliberately misrepresented through forged documentation and false historical narratives. The financial value of the fraudulent sales exceeded several £1 million, representing an extraordinary degree of criminal sophistication and planning. The mechanism of the fraud had involved the deliberate selection of ordinary, relatively inexpensive automobiles, which were then subjected to extensive cosmetic restoration to improve their aesthetic appearance. Marcus Ashford would then create elaborate false provenance documentation, complete with forged bills of sale, fabricated photographs, and historical narratives connecting each vehicle to celebrated individuals or significant historical events. The documentation was created with such meticulous attention to detail and such sophisticated understanding of automotive history that it proved nearly impossible to distinguish from legitimate historical records. Bernard Hastings would then present these vehicles to potential buyers among the wealthy collecting community, marketing them through private sales and exclusive auctions as examples of extraordinarily rare automobiles with distinguished ownership histories. The fraudulent vehicles would be sold at prices ranging from hundreds of thousands to several millions of pounds, depending on the apparent celebrity or historical significance attributed to each particular automobile. The scheme had generated extraordinary profits for both Bernard and Marcus, with Bernard contributing approximately 60% of the proceeds to the acquisition and restoration of the vehicles, while Marcus received compensation based on the sophistication and effectiveness of the documentary fraud he had created. Both men had lived extraordinarily luxurious lifestyles as a result of the fraudulent proceeds, though Marcus had supplemented his legitimate professional income with the illegal payments from Bernard. However, the systematic nature of the fraud had ultimately led to its exposure when Dr. Margaret Stanford had begun to recognize patterns of authentication misuse that suggested her professional credentials were being systematically exploited to validate fraudulent provenance. Margaret's investigation had ultimately led to the public revelation of the fraud scheme, which had destroyed her professional reputation despite her having been a victim of the conspiracy rather than a willing participant. The investigation also revealed that Bernard Hastings had begun to experience considerable moral distress regarding his involvement in the fraud scheme, particularly after the public destruction of Margaret Stanford's professional reputation. Eleanor's testimony regarding Bernard's conversations with her confirmed that he had been increasingly tormented by guilt regarding his actions and had ultimately determined to cooperate with law enforcement to expose the fraud and provide restitution to those who had been harmed by his criminal activities. This moral transformation in Bernard's perspective had represented the catalyst that had transformed a profitable but stable criminal conspiracy into a situation wherein multiple individuals possessed powerful motivations to eliminate Bernard before he could provide evidence to law enforcement authorities. While the specific mechanisms of motivation varied among James Whitfield, Marcus Ashford, and Victor Caldwell, all three men had ultimately shared the conviction that Bernard's death was preferable to the consequences that would result from his cooperation with police investigations. Chapter 10. Judgment and Reflection in the Gentle Afternoon Light. The conclusion of the investigation into Bernard Hastings' death came on a mild afternoon several weeks following the initial discovery of his body in the phantom Rolls Royce. The criminal proceedings had progressed with remarkable efficiency, with all three conspirators having provided sufficient confession and incriminating evidence to secure conviction on charges of conspiracy to commit murder. The trials themselves had attracted considerable public attention, as the case represented a fascinating conjunction of automotive history, systematic fraud, and personal revenge. James Whitfield received a sentence of 20 years imprisonment, with the judge acknowledging both his participation in the mechanical modification of the Phantom and his role in the actual murder, while also noting the genuine grievances he harboured regarding the destruction of his father's financial stability and Dr. Margaret Stanford's professional reputation. Marcus Ashford received a comparable sentence, with additional consideration given to his role in orchestrating the original fraud scheme and his attempt to silence Bernard before he could provide evidence to authorities. Victor Caldwell received the longest sentence, his deliberate and calculated luring of Bernard into the vehicle being treated as evidence of particularly callous premeditation. It was Eleanor who invited Miss Marple to spend a final afternoon at Ashworth Manor before her departure for home, and they sat together in Eleanor's garden as the afternoon light softened into early evening. The exhibition had been permanently cancelled, with all of the gathered vehicles having been inventoried and returned to their respective owners or held as evidence pending the conclusion of legal proceedings. Eleanor poured tea with the careful attention that such civilities demanded, and for several moments both women remained silent, contemplating the tragic chain of events that had transpired during what had promised to be a celebration of automotive history and mechanical artistry. "It's remarkable," Eleanor finally observed, "how easily people convince themselves that their deceptions are justified by circumstance or motivation. Bernard convinced himself that the fraud was acceptable because it resulted in beautiful automobiles being preserved and maintained. Marcus convinced himself that his actions were defensible because his legitimate expertise was undercompensated. James convinced himself that his participation in murder represented a form of justice for his father's suffering. Victor convinced himself that Bernard deserved death as punishment for for decades of romantic rejection. Indeed, Miss Marple agreed quietly, the human capacity for self-deception appears to be virtually unlimited. We are all capable of convincing ourselves that our actions are justified by circumstances, by motivation, or by historical grievance. The tragedy lies in our inability to recognize when our self-justifications have led us across moral boundaries from which return becomes impossible. "Do you believe they deserve their sentences?" Eleanor asked carefully, and Miss Marple took considerable time before responding to this difficult question. "Justice is a complex matter," she finally replied, "one that seldom provides satisfaction to anyone. Yes, I believe these men deserved punishment for their crimes. Yet I also recognize that their circumstances, their motivations, and their individual moral struggles were considerably more nuanced than simple labels of criminality might suggest." What struck me most profoundly throughout this entire matter was the capacity of individuals to rationalize and justify their actions, even as those actions caused considerable harm to innocent people. Margaret Stanford's professional reputation was destroyed through no fault of her own. Dr. Wallace's peaceful morning was disrupted by the discovery of a dead man. The entire collecting community was shaken by the revelation of systematic fraud. Yet all of this suffering arose not from a single terrible decision, but rather from a cascade of smaller decisions, each of which seemed justified at the time by the individuals who made them. As the afternoon light continued to soften, Eleanor and Miss Marple sat in companionable silence, two women who had witnessed the darker aspects of human nature and had emerged with their fundamental respect for human dignity and their commitment to truth and justice substantially intact. The vintage automobiles had been returned to their owners or had been seized as evidence, their gleaming exteriors and carefully maintained mechanical components serving as monuments to human craftsmanship and ingenuity, while simultaneously remaining reminders of the ease with which such monuments could be corrupted by human weakness and moral compromise. When Miss Marple finally departed Ashworth Manor the following morning, she carried with her the memories of a case that had illuminated the complex interplay of motivation, opportunity, and circumstance that characterizes human criminal behavior. The systematic provenance fraud, the murder conspiracy, and the carefully constructed cover stories that had initially obscured the truth had all revealed themselves through the application of careful observation, patient analysis, and a fundamental faith in the eventual triumph of truth over deception. The village of St. Mary Mead awaited her return, with its familiar rhythms, its petty scandals, and its small mysteries that had occupied much of her time and attention throughout her long life. Yet she returned to this familiar world with renewed conviction regarding the importance of careful observation and the recognition that human nature, in all its complexity and moral ambiguity, remained the most fascinating and ultimately the most instructive subject of study that any individual could undertake. As her motor car wound through the English countryside toward home, Miss Marple reflected that the case of Bernard Hastings' death would ultimately serve as yet another confirmation of the principle that had guided her investigations throughout her life. That is, that human nature is fundamentally the same across all social stations and professions, that evil and deception are far more common than simple goodness, and that the capacity of apparently respectable individuals to rationalize their participation in criminal activity remains virtually unlimited in its scope and sophistication. The autumn light filtered through the trees as she travelled homeward, and Miss Marple felt the familiar satisfaction that always accompanied the resolution of a complex mystery, combined with the sadness that inevitably followed. The recognition that her investigation, however thorough and ultimately successful, could not undo the harm that had been caused to the various individuals whose lives had been touched by Bernard Hastings's systematic fraud and the violent death that had ultimately resulted from his planned confession.